I want to bring back Larry Vance here, the deputy investigator in charge of the Transportation Safety Board's investigation into the crash. Larry, you were watching that whole ceremony. For those who may be unfamiliar with what happened, just how did this crash happen?
Well, this crash happened when, after takeoff, a small wire in the overhead area of the cockpit arced like a welding arc. The insulation material on the wire was breached, and it touched a piece of metal, which caused an arcing event. And that, of course, provided a heat source for a fire to start. But the fire needed flammable material. And the flammable material turned out to be the insulation blankets that were covering the skin of the aircraft, on the inside skin of the aircraft, and the air conditioning vents and so on. Very, very flammable. They didn't know it at the time, but it was very flammable. Caught fire. Fire spread exponentially, and the pilots didn't know because the air above the ceiling was being guided overboard of the airplane. So there was a little puff of smoke in the cockpit. The pilots knew that. That's when they decided to divert. But the fire spread exponentially until it finally affected the controls of the airplane, affected the flyability of the airplane, went into the cockpit, made the airplane unflyable, went out of control, and crashed into the ocean at high speed. Everybody was killed, and the fire was extinguished immediately.
That was 25 years ago, and I know you were part of that investigation. What was it like for you to watch this ceremony and sort of to relive that investigation?
Oh, it was very moving. I thought that was a tremendous tribute to those, not only those who perished, but those who responded. I know that I actually felt tears well up in my eyes. It brought emotions up in me that have been there underneath for all these years. It was a tremendously emotional time. Emotional because of the sadness from loss of life, from watching the family members arrive by the hundreds and having to interact with them. I can speak personally. I was part of the small group who was providing the briefings at the Lord Nelson Hotel right from the very beginning. To stand in front of hundreds of grieving family members, some of them were still holding out hope that their loved ones were still alive somehow, and passing on messages along with, of course, the others who were there, the coroners, the RCMP, the military, all their spokespeople, and me from the Transportation Safety Board, trying to give them information that would satisfy whatever needs we could satisfy at that time. We had precious little information to give them, but what we tried to give them was a sense that we wouldn't stop. We wouldn't stop trying to recover their loved ones, their personal effects. We wouldn't stop trying to recover the aircraft structure. We wouldn't stop trying to investigate what happened so we could give them some sense of why this all happened. And it ended up taking us 4.5 years before we could put out a report. But in the end, we did find out what happened. We found out exactly what happened. Quite an amazing 4.5 years it was. Because remember, we started with wreckage that was 185 feet below the ocean and broken into 2 million pieces. And the piece that we ended up finding that gave us the evidence, the final evidence as to what happened, was this small arc on an electrical wire. The arc itself was too small to see with the naked eye. To find that tiny, tiny little piece from 200 million pieces of aircraft wreckage on the bottom of the ocean was an extraordinary event. And it took an extraordinary team of people to pull that off. It was, but in the end, it created a lasting legacy for all of us, all of Canada, to have been so successful in solving this tremendous riddle and giving some closure to the grieving families and to the traveling public.
And Larry, let's talk for a moment a little bit more about the families. What did you hear from them?
Oh my, that ran the gamut. I talked personally with, I would dare say, most of the family members, because not only did we spend the first days, but because of the length of time it took to recover the wreckage, and along with that, the human remains, and to identify human remains, it took weeks and then months. And for all of that time, we were holding daily briefings every day at 4:30. I would go to the Lord Nelson Hotel, and Vic Gurdon, our investigator in charge, would go at 5 o'clock to the media center, and we would give whatever information and updates we had to the family members before we gave that information out to the media. That was something that we promised them we would do, and we held to that for all those many months, and in fact years. So after those briefings, we always stayed, all of those, like, it wasn't just me, of course, it was the primary roles at the beginning were the coroner and the RCMP and the military briefers, talking about the logistics of wreckage recovery and so on. But eventually it started to turn to what happened here. And what happened was, and determining that, was the responsibility of the Transportation Safety Board. The investigation eventually got turned over to the Transportation Safety Board, and we're the ones that put out the final report. We're the ones that examined the wreckage to determine cause. So eventually the families wanted to know what happened. And so as we got the hangar organized, where we were doing the reconstructions and so on, we set up a display at the front of the hangar, and family members were invited to come to look at the display, see what kind of wreckage that we were dealing with, what kind of evidence we were uncovering, and then to speak to us individually, to ask us any question that they might have as to what happened. And a few of us were designated to give those briefings in the hangar. I guess I could say I did the majority of them. So at any given time, we would get notice that a family had come in. They were brought in by Swissair and by Delta Airlines, who was had a code share on the flight. And they would have their caregivers with them. They would arrive at the front of the hangar in a designated vehicle, and they would get out, and there would be parents who had lost their children. There would be grandparents who had lost entire families. There would be children who lost parents. Get out of those cars. You never quite knew what to expect on a visit-by-visit basis, but they would come to the display tables, and we had a kind of a, okay, here's what you're looking at, kind of a ritual that we would go through, and then the questions would come, and it sometimes it was hard. It was really hard when they would start thanking us. They were the ones that had suffered the losses. And in some ways, it was harder when they were grieving for us, who were there, and they knew we were sacrificing 7 days a week, all that time. And then the questions would come. Inevitably, it would come down to, we would like to know what our loved ones in their last moments were seeing and feeling. In other words, were they scared? Did they suffer? And we would attempt to answer those questions for them as best we could. And this was a tragic event, and I would try and explain to them that in the back of the airplane, they would have known that there was an emergency happening because they were told to get ready for a diversion and a landing, that they were going to Halifax. And so they would be preparing for that. And our investigation discovered that there really wasn't a time when there was much smoke in the cabin area, in the passenger cabin area of the aircraft. And remember, this was in the dark of night. So they wouldn't know or have much orientation by looking out the windows and so on exactly what was happening. So up until the very end, they would have been preparing for a landing in Halifax.
Larry, thank you. Larry, thank you so much for your time. It's such a tragic event. So many individuals affected by all of this. We appreciate you joining us this morning.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.